If you were here last time, you remember that the reason why I put this together was to think about where some common beliefs that Jews and Christians and Muslims share, where those beliefs come from. And of course, there's always a theological answer to where convictions come from. They come from revelation, right? They come from the mind of God. What I'm trying to do is to have us explore what the historical context of the emergence of beliefs is. Right? Wherever they come from in the mind of God, they come in a particular point in time and in response to a particular set of historical circumstances. And if we understand those circumstances, we can learn a lot about those beliefs. So last time, in looking at the origins of the Maccabean revolt and the persecution of Antiochus of the Jews, in that situation, the situation of martyrdom, that novel experience in human history up till that point, I suggested that therein lies the basis of the doctrine of resurrection and the life of the world to come, which Jews and Christians and Muslims all share. So we looked at how that experience that the Jews faced during the 2nd century BC led to the development of this core belief that we would share ever since. It came to consciousness in the people themselves at this time. And so we looked at this story from the perspective of the Maccabees, who were the freedom fighters, right, who fought against the persecutors of the Jewish people from 167 to 164 BCE. And we then followed the career of Judas, or Judah, the Maccabee, the hammer, who was sort of the military hero of this story, through his life, to the end of his life in the year 161, 160, thereabouts, where he was finally terminated by the empire, the Seleucid Empire. That was the Greek empire that was ruling the Near East at the time. Judas lost his life in battle with the Seleucid army. And one of the reasons why I was looking at what happened after Hanukkah, from 164 to then, was to see what were Judas's aims. Right? Because I made a point when we were looking at the history of the rebellion, the history of the revolt that he led against the Seleucids, made the point that we actually have evidence in one of the biblical texts, what is in the Christian Bible, 2nd Maccabees, we have evidence that Antiochus, the persecuting king, actually rescinded the persecution decree. He gave up the fight because it was not worth his while anymore to persecute the Jews. And yet Judas fought on after the cause for this war had ended. So what was Judas fighting for? We know that he didn't like the high priest that the Seleucids had put in office. He was opposed to this priest. And the one thing that actually brought Judas to the negotiation table, we learned, was when one of the Seleucid generals said, instead of fighting you, why don't I give you something you want? So what do you want? Judas's answer was, I want to be the successor to the high priest. And then we talked about how the high priest then sabotaged those negotiations, which basically led to a battle and gave Judas no other recourse to peaceful solution, and so he had to fight. But in doing so, he exposed part of what his real intention was. As himself a member of a priestly family, he at minimum wanted to prevent the high priest from being an appointee of a foreign empire. But perhaps more than that, he wanted to be high priest. He wanted his family to take over the high priesthood. What we're going to talk about today is how they did that. So we're going to continue following the history of this family, this Jewish family of priests, from the year 160 BC, where Judas dies, until 37 BCE. Right, so we go from the mid-2nd century to the late 1st century BCE. Why is the year 37 significant? That is the year in which the last Maccabean, or I'm going to use the term Hasmonean. So the Maccabees, we sometimes call this family the Maccabees because of Judas's nickname Maccabeus, the hammer. But their real name are the Hasmoneans. They are the sons of Hasmonean, a priest from an earlier period. So we call them the Hasmoneans. So we're going to trace the history of this family from its rise to power after Judas to its final downfall in the year 37, BCE, when the final Hasmonean high priest was executed on the orders of a Roman general after another Jew, Herod the Great, conquered Jerusalem on Rome's behalf. And then that was the beginning of the Herodian period, the period of Herod's rule. And this is a nice arc, a bridge that I'm going to tell this story with today, because this is the bridge between the Tanakh and the Christian New Testament and the origins of the rabbinic movement. Right? So this century and a half that we're covering today, this is that gap where our scriptures end and our own story as Jews inspired by the traditions of the rabbis and Christians inspired by Rabbi Jesus, where our story begins. And so what is the important doctrine or belief that emerged as a result of the story of the Hasmoneans, as a result of their success and ultimate failure? It is the doctrine of the Messiah, the coming Messiah. So where does the idea of the Messiah come from? Any believing Jew, any believing Christian, any believing Muslim will tell you it came from God. Right? It is, as Bereshit Rabbah, one of the rabbinic writings, said, the Messiah was already in the mind of God before creation. So, like Israel and the Torah, it's just one of those things that was already part of the divine plan. But of course, no one knew this in history. When did people start talking of a Messiah, an anointed one, who is to come? Not a previous ruler, not simply restoring some sort of native dynasty, but a future ruler. Where does that idea come from? It comes as a reaction, a Jewish reaction to the experience of Hasmonean rule, and ultimately of the failure of Hasmonean rule. So I'm going to give you today basically a story about political history, but its significance for understanding this core doctrine of our faiths is immense. Now, how do we know that the Hasmoneans, in a sense, caused Jews to start to reflect on what this idea of Messiah might be? Well, basically because they turned out to be bad rulers, oppressive rulers. The liberators of Israel became Israel's own oppressors when we get into the 1st century BC. And not only were they oppressive in their rule, some of them, but they also claimed not only to be priests, but kings. So this is a major change that happens. Judas was a hero, a military hero. He wanted to be high priest, but he didn't want to be king. Of course, we know in the tradition of the Tanakh, of the Old Testament, it is the house of David that has been given the eternal covenant of kingship. Right? So when we speak of an anointing of someone for a royal or a ruling role, and we're not talking about a priest, then we're talking about the house of David. But in fact, from the year 500 BCE to the year 100 BCE, more or less, we have no evidence that any Jew of the time, whether in Israel or outside of it, was even interested in this concept of Davidic rule. Right? That simply was not part of the contemporary Jewish mental map, except as the tradition of the house of David back then. What happens in the 1st century BCE in response to Hasmonean rule is Jews start to contemplate, well, here are these kings who are ruling us and we don't really like them. What would an ideal ruler look like? And so you go back to your tradition. You go back and reflect on the various prophets, right, who speak of the restoration of the house of David and all of this. And you think of this not simply as a historical event, but as a future climactic eschatological event, an event that signals the world to come. So here we're tying together that doctrine of the world to come and resurrection that we talked about last time to the idea of the Messiah, an ideal ruler who somehow inaugurates or signifies that it has come. This reflection did not begin until the 1st century BCE. I can say that because we now have a good amount of Jewish literature outside the Bible that testifies that Jews are thinking these thoughts. The church has known this for a long time because it is the church that preserved some of these extra-biblical Jewish writings. And Jews, of course, have rediscovered them and reused them. But these are, there is a composition of poems from the 1st century BCE called the Psalms of Solomon. And it is basically a reflection on the downfall of the Hasmonean dynasty and what it means. And it is there that we first get this idea of a Davidic Messiah as a future coming figure. It's in the 1st century BC. We also have the book of Enoch. Most of us probably don't hear about the book of Enoch. We don't know about it because we're not Ethiopian Christians. The Ethiopian church, the Eastern church in Ethiopia, one of the oldest Christian churches, is one of the only living religious communities that preserves the literature that Jews wrote during the first 3 centuries BCE on the figure of Enoch as part of their Old Testament. This is part of their canon. It was part of the Western canon too, but eventually fell by the wayside for some reason. But anyway, Enoch, of course, is this primordial figure from Genesis 5, where we hear about the descendants of Adam. Enoch is this curious, mysterious figure who, unlike every other person during that time who simply had children and died in the genealogy, he, we're told, walked with Elohim, either with God or with the gods, perhaps understood as angelic beings, but he walked with God or with the gods, and God took him. That's what we hear in the Tanakh. And if we read the literature that Jews wrote about this figure Enoch, we find there's an entire mythology about this guy. One of the earliest human beings is sort of transformed into an apocalyptic seer who sees all human history and surveys it from the perspective of heaven, because God takes him up into heaven. He has a visionary experience and sees sort of a map of all human history, rather like the book of Daniel, only more so. Anyway, in the books of Enoch, one of the books of Enoch, a portion of the book of Enoch called the Book of Parables, which is usually dated the 1st century BCE or maybe even the 1st century CE. It may even be later than our period, but at least people have argued it comes from the fall of the Hasmonean dynasty. You have these visions of a heavenly being called the Son of Man. Obviously, they're drawing upon the figure from Daniel, who is also the Messiah, something Daniel doesn't say. Right? So you have this composite character in the books of Enoch. The Messiah, the chosen one, the righteous one, the Son of Man, all these biblical characters are drawn together into this single heavenly person who is to judge all humanity at the end of time on God's behalf. And we'll look at these passages. This all comes from a response, in a sense, to the fall of the Hasmonean dynasty. There is going to be an ideal anointed ruler who is yet to come, who we are not experiencing now. Finally, we're going to look at all this literature in a bit, but I want to just give you a snippet of what it's going to look like. So we have the Psalms of Solomon from the 1st century BCE. We have the book of Enoch from the 1st century BCE. And we also have, of course, the literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of which was written all the way back during the period that we were talking about. During the time, perhaps even of Judas Maccabee, certainly from the time of his brother, Jonathan, with whose story we begin today. The people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't just copy the Bible. They also wrote what we call sectarian literature. They wrote documents about themselves as a community. And many of these documents attest already in the 2nd century BCE to an expectation, a hope of an ideal ruler, or rather a set of rulers, a pair of rulers who will come. They are both called anointed ones, messiahs, and one is a priest and the other one is a descendant of David. So there are 2 messiahs in this understanding, mainly because this was a priestly group at Qumran, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, and they understood that the ideal form of rule in God's design for Israel is a king and a priest, with the priest on top, as we'll see. So we have a lot of snippets in the scraps that we get from these sectarian documents in the Dead Sea Scrolls that also attest from the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century BCE, the heyday of Hasmonean rule. This is what provokes the doctrine of the Messiah, if you will. This is what provokes the reinterpretation of the theme of divinely authorized rule, of divinely guided rule, in the midst where the Jews are not experiencing rule that is terribly divinely guided, at least the experience of those who criticize the Hasmoneans. The Dead Sea Scrolls community would not have come into existence if the Hasmoneans had not become high priests. Jonathan, who is the hero of our story today, he is called the wicked priest by the Dead Sea Scrolls sect. One of his descendants, Alexandra, who we'll talk about later too, is called the Lion of Wrath. They have really nasty names among the Dead Sea Scrolls people. According to them, Jonathan, Judas's brother, actually tried to kill their teacher. We're not sure whether this actually happened or not, but they present themselves as a persecuted minority. So there's a lot to look at today. What I want to do is begin by giving the history, the story. Okay, so let's begin. And this is just your handout here. Actually, can we advance it up a bit so I can see the timeline? We just basically follow the timeline. That'll be my set of cues here as to what we're talking about. And I've squared it off in terms of which Hasmonean is leading the show. Now, actually, I want to start out with a line from the book of 1 Maccabees. Remember, 1 Maccabees is one of the major narratives that we have of the Hasmonean dynasty, or rather of its founding. We talked about 2 Maccabees last time. That's the story of the martyrs that we read and talked about. So we have these two books that give an account of certainly the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty. 2 Maccabees is basically interested in the theological meaning of the persecution, as we've seen. He's interested in what the persecution means and how it leads to this understanding that God, being a God of justice, will redeem and bring back to life those who have been mutilated and destroyed by the persecutor. That's resurrection. He's not really interested in the Hasmonean so much. Judas is a hero, but again, his heroism depends on the sacrifices of the martyrs. The heroism of the martyrs empowers the Maccabees to do what they do. 1 Maccabees, on the other hand, which is where I get most of this story from, is basically dynastic propaganda. It's the Hasmoneans' own argument for why they should rule. For why they should rule. And there is even an interesting line in 1 Maccabees itself. Back in 164 BCE, after the rededication of the temple at Hanukkah, Judas and his brothers, to show how heroic they were, they went around and basically attacked their neighbors so that they could rescue the oppressed Jews who were living there and bring them back to the safety of Jerusalem, thereby creating a source of manpower and an army for themselves in the process. But again, they went to do this. In the story of those raids to the neighbors of Judea, we hear of some subordinates, some other leaders of the revolt, who try their own hand at delivering the Jews, and they fail. And the narrator, the author of 1 Maccabees, says the reason why they failed is they didn't recognize that God had chosen the Maccabees as the ones through whom Israel would be delivered. So the perspective, the theology, the ideology of the author of 1 Maccabees is that the Hasmoneans have been called by God to deliver their people from crisis, from disaster. In other words, they are called by God to be like the judges of old from the Old Testament, from the book of Judges, right? The judge is the one, he or she, who rises up at the particular moment to save Israel, right? And then they go back to ordinary life for the most part. This is what the Maccabees do according to their own propaganda. But notice, it doesn't say this was the family God chose to rule. So even in their own self-promotion, their shameless self-promotion, they concede that, or at least they do not claim to be, that as regular rulers of Israel, that has not been mandated by God. Now the only reason why they would say that, why they would fail to say that rather, is because their rule, when it did come about, was precarious from the beginning. In other words, their rule could only be established through compromise and through voluntary self-limitation of their powers. And we'll see an example of this in an important document that they drafted, which was sort of the constitution of their rule. Basically, God chose us to deliver you, but we have to work it out amongst ourselves how we will rule ourselves from now on. We will have to agree to compromise with various groups, warring factions, to allow us to lead. And basically, the theological way out they gave was to say, when a trustworthy prophet arises to say otherwise, then we will we will do whatever that prophet says. If he says rule or if he says don't rule. But until a trustworthy prophet shall arise, we will rule Israel. So notice there too, they justify their rule saying until a prophet arises, someone ordained by God to speak, to name a ruler, and divinely mandated, we will not claim to be divinely mandated. We will simply show you that if we don't rule, Israel will be perpetually in need of deliverance, and that's why we're here. There are all sorts of characters who appear in this book who are not Hasmoneans, and they always are either trying to undermine the Hasmoneans or they are trying to undermine the liberation that they have achieved. They're called pernicious men. Right? They're not even named usually. They're just the bad guys. You know, maybe the people from Qumran were some of those bad guys in their view. We don't know. But clearly, from the beginning, there was opposition. There was resistance to this idea of being ruled. Okay, but that's enough introduction. So now let's tell the story. When Jonathan, the brother of Judas, took up the mantle of leadership in the year 160, the Maccabean revolt was in disarray. They had been roundly defeated, scattered by the Seleucid forces. They and their supporters were being butchered by a Seleucid general, and there was a famine to boot, so it was hard to sustain themselves outside of Jerusalem. So they were really, and they had, Judas had asked the Romans to denounce, right, the Seleucid rule, the oppression of Seleucid rule, and the Romans said, sure, we'll send a letter. But it didn't affect anything. So things looked pretty grim. Everything had failed, in essence. But out of that rubble came Jonathan. And Jonathan was a competent military leader. He was on the land for most of his early career. But eventually, actually in the second year of his leadership, Alchemist, that's the high priest at the time, the guy who sabotaged Judas's peacemaking efforts, Alchemist died of natural causes, presumably. Second Maccabees says that he died because he tried to alter the protocol of the temple, and so he was stricken by God. We can't confirm that. But he was out of the picture. The interesting thing, though, is that no one at this point in the year 159 attempted to reappoint or to appoint a new high priest. In other words, that 2-year civil war that had gone on between Judas and Alchemist's supporters, which had left hundreds, maybe thousands of Jews dead, no one was willing to step into that trap again, at least not at the moment. Things were too tense. And so, for a couple of years at least, it seems that there was no sort of official, regular high priest, which leads you to wonder, how did they celebrate the great festivals? How did they celebrate Yom Kippur? It's possible that there was a kind of auxiliary high priest, someone who could be deputized just for a purpose of officiating at a ceremony. We don't know. We simply don't know. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, many people speculated maybe the teacher of righteousness, the head of the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, was the priest, and he was booted out of office by Jonathan when he became priest, and that's why they hated each other. We don't know. The likelihood, though, is that there was no officially appointed high priest. But that was to change. A year later, or maybe 2 years later, the enemies of Jonathan tried to bring the same guy who killed Judas back to Judea to basically smash his rebellion for good. And surprisingly, Jonathan walked right up to the general and said, I don't want to fight you, let's talk. So this is the killer of his brother. I don't want to fight you, let's talk, let's resolve this peaceably. Now, of course, he had held out for a long time. The Maccabean rebels were troublesome, and if a Seleucid could deal with them through negotiation, he certainly would, and that's exactly what happened. And he appointed Jonathan, or he allowed Jonathan to, as First Maccabees says, judge the people. Again, in the mold of the ancient judges of the Old Testament, he allowed him to judge the people at a town called Michmash, so outside of Jerusalem. There was still, he couldn't capture Jerusalem for himself, he had to stay outside, but at least there was no more war going on. So he had made the first step, which was going to be a fateful one, in which every success of this dynasty that would be achieved through cooperation with the Seleucids, not with rebellion against them. So at this point, if you will, you could say that the Maccabean revolt is over. Now eventually, the Hasmoneans will declare independence for Israel. They'll say, we are no longer under anyone's rule. But that is a long process. It began with Jonathan working with the empire rather than against it. And it served him well. In the year 152, the Seleucid Empire was falling into a civil war of its own, and this would pretty much be its fate from then on to its date of death, which was 64 BCE. It basically, there was no king could stay in office for very long, and if he did, he usually had 2 or maybe 3 competitors who also claimed to be kings. The Seleucid Empire broke up into sort of a belt of smaller kingdoms where each Seleucid king claimed to rule everything, but never could rule everything at the same time. So Jonathan took advantage of this civil war because each of the kings wanted the support of Jonathan because they knew he was a military leader, and if you can get someone in the Judean hills on your side, then you can control access pretty much to anywhere in Palestine. So they went into a bidding war. If you ally with me, Jonathan, I'll give you the right to recruit soldiers, build an army. If you join me, Jonathan, said the other, I'll make you high priest. Jonathan happily took both offers. Jonathan, in the year 152, becomes high priest. So he achieves the office which Judas could not. And in doing so, at a stroke, he went from rebel to ruler. He solved the problem of legitimacy. Right? Judas couldn't overcome the legitimacy of Alchemists, not even with the Roman self. Jonathan did it by making peace with the Seleucids. So that's how his story ended. He was assassinated later on, and his brother Seeman, which again is a brother of Judas, so this is the last of the brothers Maccabee, if you will. Seeman, in the year 142, takes over from his brother, and also eventually takes over as high priest, first by politely asking the new Seleucid king, will you make me high priest? Of course, because I need your weapons to support my cause. So again, collaboration with the Seleucids was the way forward. Seeman expressed his gratitude to the Seleucid ruler by attacking the Acra, which is the Seleucid garrison that was put in the middle of Jerusalem. Not a very good way to make friends with the king. But again, this was the symbol as well as the instrument of Seleucid control. If you could wipe out that garrison, then Judea could really be independent. And he succeeds. In the year 141, says First Maccabees, the yoke of the Gentiles was removed. And so this was a big thing. So Seeman basically declared independence. He was still allied with the Seleucid king, but he declared independence. He was now in control of Jerusalem. The next year, there was a popular decree, popular meaning of the whole people, that honored Seeman for the accomplishments of himself and the accomplishments of his family. And why don't we, you want to switch over to the other text document that we have, which should have some stuff about Seeman here. The other one. Yeah, that one right there. Okay, so actually let's go through this one. This is a little song, a eulogy that is sung for the greatness of Seeman in First Maccabees. So we go past that here. Advance up a little. Okay, here we go. Let's actually bring that chapter heading to the top so we can. Okay, so it says, when the people heard these things, which means everything Seeman has accomplished, which also, by the way, included normalizing diplomatic relations with the Roman Republic. In fact, it was when when his embassy to Rome, which Judas had tried earlier, he sent an embassy to Rome to get recognition, basically, and he got it. He got friendship and alliance with the Roman Republic. And when his envoys, when the Jewish envoys returned from Italy, it says that when the people saw and heard these things, they said, what thanks shall we give back to Seeman and his sons? For he himself and his brothers and his father's house have stood firm and fought off the enemies of Israel and have established its freedom. So they engraved a decree on bronze tablets and set it on pillars on Mount Zion. And here's the copy of the decree. Let's move it forward so we can read it. It's a long decree, but we really need to read it because this is the core of this whole issue of the authority of the Hasmoneans, their argument for themselves, and how it ultimately will break down. Okay, so introduction. Everyone basically gathered together in Jerusalem in an assembly to make this motion. Right? The motion was, and then you have a long list of considerations. Whereas they have done this and that, and let's just look at them. Whereas wars have come upon the country many times, but Simon, son of Mattathias, a priest of the sons of Yoariv, that is, say, Aaronites, and his brothers have gave themselves over to danger, stood against the adversaries of their nation, so that their sanctuary and law might stand, and they glorified their nation with great glory. And whereas Jonathan, right, the predecessor, brought their nation together and became for them a high priest and was added to his people, and whereas their enemies, thank you, sought to invade their country and stretch out their hands against the sanctuary, then Simon rose up and waged war on behalf of his nation and spent much of his own money and armed the men of power of his nation and gave them wages. So notice he's built a standing army for himself. And fortified the cities of Judea, including those on its borders. And whereas he fortified the town of Joppa upon the sea, so notice he's extended, he's turned Judea from a landlocked county the size of Stark into a regional power that extends to the Mediterranean. He did this too, it says. On account of all these things, and on account of the justice and fidelity which he maintained towards the nation and devoted himself in every way to raise up his people, and whereas, this is getting kind of long here, whereas in his days affairs prospered in his hands so that the Gentiles were expelled from their country, and those in the city of David who made for themselves a citadel, that's the citadel he besieged. Simon expelled that garrison, the garrison did with his own men, and move it up a little more. And finally, whereas King Demetrius, that's the king, the Seleucid king who appointed him, he appointed him high priest on account of all these things and made him one of his friends and glorified him with great glory. And then it says, for whereas, and then it's unclear who the person here. It could be he, Demetrius, the Seleucid monarch, or it could be it, the assembly of the Jews. Whereas they heard that the Judeans were addressed by the Romans as friends and allies and brothers, and that they honorably received the envoys of Simon, in consideration of all those great things Simon has done, because of the wonderful things he's done, be it resolved that the Judeans, the priests, have deemed it fitting that Simon should be their leader, their high priest, indefinitely, until a trustworthy prophet should arise, and that he should be their general, and that he should be given custodianship of the sanctuary, and that he should appoint men over its functions, and over the countryside, and over the weapons, and over the fortresses, and that he should be obeyed by all, and that all contracts in the country should be written in his name, and that he should wear purple and gold, a distinctive dress, and that it shall be forbidden for anyone of the people or of the priests to abrogate any of these things, or to oppose things said by Simon, or to convene an assembly in the country without him, or to wear purple or put on a golden clasp, to dress like him. And whoever acts contrary to these things or abrogates any of them shall be liable for punishment. According to the author, this was a spontaneous upwelling of popular love for what Simon says. Clearly, though, the language is that of a dictator. So it's very apparent here that he is seeking legitimacy. He's seeking a formal recognition of the people for not only being high priest, but being leader, ruler. And he wants to be obeyed by all. Notice, a trustworthy prophet could come along and said, you're not high priest anymore. But notice that no one of Israel is allowed to say anything against him or have an assembly to discuss him without him being present. So basically, any prophet that arose would really have to have a creative way of communicating that would somehow get through this, this gauntlet. So Simon's authority is self-perpetuating in this thing. But notice the language. He is to be high priest and all these things indefinitely. Ad olam in Hebrew. Ad olam does not actually always or necessarily mean forever. It means indefinitely. So notice that even the language here stops short of saying, not only am I going to be high priest, but I'm going to establish a dynasty of high priests. This is not stated. There's nothing about his sons in this document. Even though in the introduction of the document, the question is, how should we thank Simon and his sons for all they've done? The document only speaks about him. So he was clearly, in making these absolutist claims, he had to be tiptoeing very carefully in a political minefield. To establish a dynasty apparently would have been suicide for him at that point. And so, we also have to remember that back when we were talking about before the Maccabean revolt, before the persecution, there was this dynasty of high priests that had ruled Israel, depending on how far back you want to go, for about 8 centuries, called the Zadokites, or more specifically the Oneid family. The Zadokites were descended from Solomon's high priest. Right? So for 8 centuries, Israel had been governed, religiously at least, by a single family of high priests. Now, Simon is basically ending that story of the Zadokites, the Oneids. And this, too, would be a politically touchy move, because actually the Oneids continued to exist as high priests. They were still at large, but they were in Egypt. They fled to Egypt, either because of the persecution or because of the Maccabees, perhaps. And in Egypt, they built a temple. They were invited by the Egyptian king to build a temple in the eastern delta of the Nile. And there, a colony of Jews, a community of Jews, gathered. And we actually have several inscriptions from this community that long outlived these high priests, but they had their own, despite Deuteronomy saying you can only worship God in the one place, they had a temple, a functioning temple. So it was, if you will, a high priesthood in exile. So by saying, I will be high priest indefinitely, is sort of acknowledging that I am consciously saying no to them, but I'm also not saying I'm starting a new dynasty. Very delicate balancing act. And very likely, the language of the trustworthy prophet is also there as saying, maybe placating, the sort of the religious right of the day. No, I'm not making any new theological claims by this. Any prophet who comes to tell me otherwise, I will obey, he says. But so clearly, behind the scenes here, there's a lot going on. The most important thing to notice, though, in this whole panoply, look at all those whereases. Look at all those considerations. Yes, it's mentioned that he is a priestly lineage, otherwise he couldn't be priest at all. So lineage meant something. But almost all of the considerations are not about birth. They're about achievement. I deserve this because of my achievements on behalf of all you. This is a very conventional form of decree in the Greek world, where the people of a city will honor a benefactor, or in the empires of that world, the subjects will honor their monarch for all the wonderful things he's done, right? This is exactly the language, the idiom that Simon is using to legitimize a radical break in Jewish tradition up until that time, which had been already interrupted by the persecution and all that, of who was the high priest. So his most potent weapon against the Oneids wasn't to claim, God has appointed us to be your new high priest, but rather to say, my high priesthood is based on achievement, not birth. So we're not yet at a dynasty, but we're at a place where clearly he's trying to set things up so that it could evolve into that, perhaps. So you see the importance of this, the revolutionary character of this document in the tradition of Judaism. It establishes a totally new basis for priesthood, for the high priesthood at least. Okay, so that's what Simon says. Simon had declared independence. Right? We have liberated you. The yoke of the Gentiles is removed. It was a short-lived hope, however. Simon was himself, why don't we go back to our timeline here, Simon was himself assassinated by his son-in-law, who evidently wanted to take his place. And his son-in-law called up the Seleucid king of the time, whose name was Antiochus, not the Antiochus back then, but Antiochus VII. There's a lot of Antiochuses. Calls up Antiochus VII and he says, look, I've just killed Simon, who has been a deterrent to your reassertion of power in this region. If you support me, I'll support you. So at least the story tells this as a regression back to the pre-liberation days when the Seleucids ruled Israel. So there was an attempt to railroad, in a sense, the Maccabean, the Hasmonean project here. But it failed, mainly because Simon's son, one of Simon's sons, whose name was John Hyrcanus, succeeded in getting rid of the assassins and establishing himself with the people, becoming high priest in his father's stead. Again, mainly because he is presented, when he appears in the book of 1 Maccabees, there's never any indication that he is destined to lead. Rather, it simply shows that he is a great military leader like his father. So again, he too can claim to have achieved the right to this office. So this is John Hyrcanus. He's the pivotal figure in our story because it is in his day that Judea actually did achieve independence. He established a sovereign Jewish state in Palestine. He had a bit of a setback because Antiochus did come and invade, besieged Jerusalem for over a year, and finally took the city, although actually John surrendered to him so that he could negotiate some favorable terms. But basically it was a return to the good old days of Seleucid rule. We know from archaeology that for 2 years John minted coinage with the image of the Seleucid ruler on it. So clearly he was now a vassal. He was a subordinate as the high priest. Fortunately for him, history intervened and killed off Antiochus. At this point in history, we're in the late 2nd century BCE. In these years, actually even before this, the eastern half of the Seleucid Empire, the part that went all the way to Iran, had basically crumbled under the weight of a new military force. Namely, we call these the Parthians. The Parthians were a Central Asian nomadic people who eventually came and took over the apparatus of the Seleucid Empire, became Hellenized, became Greekified, and they were basically moving westwards, taking things over. By the time of John Hyrcanus, they had already reached Babylonia, which was one of the 2 cores of the Seleucid Empire. So basically, Antiochus had to go on a military expedition to Iraq, where he was killed. And so suddenly, John is rejoicing. You know, I'm not a servant of him anymore. He's not there. So John celebrated by attacking his neighbors. He is celebrated by becoming an imperialist in his own right. With the Seleucid rule temporarily in abeyance in Palestine, he proceeded to attack and invade and conquer and incorporate his neighbors into a greater Judean state. He is the main architect of this. We don't actually have a lot of details about the chronology, but just a couple of bits here. And actually, why don't we go to our map, because that'll give a little visual for it here.
Who was John's father? Simon?
John's father was Simon. So, and that's in the little chart at the beginning of the handout. It says whose brother or father. So, so here we have Judea, which now extends to Joppa and a few ports. He invaded Idumea, which is the southern neighbor. Right? That's where the Edomites lived, the Idumeans, the descendants of Esau. And we actually have, again, we can do some archaeological stuff here, in the year, either the year 111 or 107, depending on when we are to date a certain weight, a lead weight that was found in the city of Marashah, which is one of the major capitals of the Idumean area. John conquered Idumea and made it part of greater Judea, as it were. And this, of course, Idumea will be the source for many of the Hasmoneans' allies, and indeed it will be also the source for their executioner, Herod the Great, who was an Idumean by ancestry. So that was his first conquest. He conquered some of Transjordan. The big news is when he entered Samaria. Remember, Samaria was the ancient remnant of the northern kingdom of Israel. We know that Israelites continued to live there down through the days of the Maccabees. These are called the Samaritans, although they call themselves the Israelites. They worshipped God at their own temple, which had been built under the Persians, just as the Jews had built their new temple under the Persians in the 5th century BCE. It had been expanded under Antiochus III, the guy who conquered Palestine for the Seleucids in the year 200. John Hyrcanus went there with a Jewish army and destroyed it. He destroyed Shechem, which was the main Samaritan sort of center of population, and he destroyed the temple on Mount Gerizim to make sure that there would be no competition for Jerusalem, for Mount Zion. Of course, he could simply appeal to the book of Deuteronomy. Right? God said we're supposed to build our temple in Mount Zion, not anywhere else. But then again, the Samaritans had their own Pentateuch, their own Torah that said otherwise. So, who was right here? Anyway, we actually can date this very, very clearly to the year 111 or 110 BCE, because thanks to the work of the Israeli archaeologist Yitzhak Magid, who's been working at this site for about 30 years on Mount Gerizim, he actually found the remains of the attack, and there were fortunately coins there that could be dated, so we can date it exactly to that year now. So this was a big deal. Right? This means that the Maccabees are now aspiring to in a sense, reestablish all Israel. What John Hyrcanus and his descendants do is they recreate an Israel which is bigger than Solomon's Israel. Not quite bigger, but it's comparable. It's the first time in 5 or 6 or 7 centuries that this had happened. Not only was Judea an independent Jewish state, but this was now going to be a greater Palestine, if you will. We know the Israelites, the Samaritans survived, because as they survive today, although they're much fewer in number, but they had no temple at this point. That's why the Samaritans are so pissed off at the Jews always in the New Testament, where you hear stories about the Samaritans and the Jews not liking each other. And of course, in the story in John's Gospel where Jesus hangs out with the Samaritan woman at the well, he still is a bit unecumenical in saying salvation is from the Jews, you Samaritan, but the time is coming when you too will worship the God of Israel in a new way. So, this is where we get all this image of hostility between Jews and Samaritans, because they destroyed their temple. Right? Think about the hostility that later Jews had towards the Romans in the literature of the rabbis, because they destroyed Jerusalem. Well, the Samaritans had their own sort of debacle there. Anyway, that was just a stepping stone. The big conquest was Samaria, the capital city itself. This was a new thing in the crumbling Seleucid world. This is the first time that a Jewish power, a Hasmonean warlord, had actually captured and razed to the ground a major Hellenistic city, a major Greek city in Palestine. And that, people took notice of that. They were now a power to be reckoned with, not to be messed with, and they could hold their own for the most part against the surviving remnants of the Seleucid dynasty. At this point, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus says John would no longer either serve or help any Seleucids. He had truly brought liberation, independence to Israel. Okay, let's go back to our timeline. And let's move on to, let's see, who's next here. So we move now from John Hyrcanus. Let's go to, bring the bottom of the page up to his son, Aristobulus. By the way, Aristobulus is, of course, a Greek name. But all of the Greek names the Hasmoneans now have, they also had Hebrew names. So this was actually Judas Aristobulus. That's we know from his coinage. So who was Judas Aristobulus? He was a son of John Hyrcanus. And what was his great innovation? His great innovation was kingship. He declared himself not only to... So he went beyond the terms. He went beyond the rhetoric of legitimation that Seeman had put forth in that great decree. He said, I am now king. Now you can always ask, what's the difference? What's the difference between a king and an absolute dictator, which is what Seeman and his son, John Hyrcanus, had been? What's the real difference? Did Jews really suddenly become offended by the title of king? What was at stake here in this change of terminology? Well, what was at stake, the substance of the difference between a ruler and a king was not so much the title. It's not so much what he could do per se, but the fact that he came to power without consultation. Right? That Seeman had to consult the whole people, even if he had to, threaten them a bit, maybe, to get them to say yes. But he felt he needed to consult the whole people. At least the aristocracy, we should assume here. So the Jewish aristocracy, whoever were the power holders at the time, they were key to the success of these rulers. What a king is someone who doesn't need aristocrats. He doesn't need to consult anyone. Now, exactly how Aristobulus came to power is interesting because we're told that John Hyrcanus, when he died, he left at least control of the succession, if not actual rule, not to his son Aristobulus, but to his widow. To his widow, whose name we don't know. So this is interesting, that as the Hasmonean family moves into monarchic mode, into kingship mode, it is the widow of the former king who it is, in a sense, positioned to appoint the next king, or even perhaps to rule herself. There's not a grand tradition in Judaism, of course, or in the ancient Israel of this, other than, what was her name, Athaliah? Right? Athaliah in the Old Testament, she imposes a rule because she was the widower. She was the widow of a dead king in Jerusalem, but she didn't really succeed very much. Now, following sort of the practice of the Hellenistic, the Greek dynasties, the Hasmoneans now sort of adopted this model of rule. So she didn't want Aristobulus to be king, so he had her killed. And perhaps this is why, another reason why he felt he had to claim kingship, because kingship is a self-authenticating authority. You don't need to consult anyone for it. So maybe because he wasn't the chosen one, he thought that if he claimed kingship, then he would, in a sense, not have to be friendly with the rest of his family. This was common practice among Hellenistic kings. The survival rate for most people in Hellenistic dynasties is not great if you're not the ruler. The Egyptians were very good at this, the Ptolemies. But anyway, the first Jewish king since 586, the first Jewish king since 586, comes to power. He only rules for a year, so we really don't know about the impact that he made, because he died of an illness, we're told. But and he also had to imprison all of his brothers. When he died, his widow, his wife, released one of his brothers, and may have actually married him too, we're not sure. She appointed one of his brothers king, and this was Alexander Jannaeus. Alexander Jannaeus. This is the Lion of Wrath, as the Qumranites called him. He was about sort of rock bottom, the worst possible ruler that the Hasmoneans produced. He was not very good militarily, so he couldn't really justify himself that way. He was very repressive. He spent most of his reign in a civil war with the Jews, with his own subjects. And he just really was not a nice guy. It's during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus that bad blood begins between the Hasmoneans and one of the famous Jewish sects of the 1st century CE, namely the Pharisees. We first hear about Pharisees and Sadducees, these terms that Christians know from the New Testament and Jews know from the writings of the rabbis after 70, as being two major sectarian groups within Judaism at this time. They first emerge in response to the success of the Hasmoneans' rule, and they come to either support them or not support them. The Pharisees apparently were part of this revolt against Jannaeus, and he thanked them by crucifying about 500 or 600 of them while he ate with his concubines grapes and watched them die. So he was not a nice guy. So he lasted a long time, though. He successfully held this iron grip over the people as king. When the next succession took place in the year 76, I believe, here we come to a more benign, at least representation of Hasmonean rule in our sources. First Maccabees ends its story with the accession of John Hyrcanus, the son of Seeman, the beginning of this dynasty. That's where First Maccabees ends, and it's very likely that John Hyrcanus composed or commissioned the writing of First Maccabees to justify his rule. But after First Maccabees goes silent, we are basically reliant on Josephus, the Jewish historian, to fill in the gaps of this history. And Josephus writes that when Alexander Jannaeus died, everyone cheered, but then his widow, again, whose name was Shalomzion Alexandra, Shalomzion, the peace of Zion, was her Hebrew name, Alexandra was her Greek name. Shalomzion, sometimes called Salome in Greek, but Shalomzion is her name we know from contemporary evidence. She is the only successful ruling Jewish queen in history. And she had a fairly long rule, and there is some criticism of her by Josephus for being too cozy with the Pharisees. And of course he says it's because she was an incredulous woman, that she allowed them to govern while she governed in appearance. That's just Josephus the misogynist speaking. He couldn't conceal the fact that she was the most successful Hasmonean ruler in terms of both keeping the conquests safe. At that time, her army was twice as big as anything any of her predecessors could even have fielded. No one in the neighborhood was powerful enough to challenge her. She almost took control of Damascus because she was so successful as a ruler, and she wasn't oppressive as a ruler, so she did pretty well. The Pharisees have good things to say about her in rabbinic tradition, about some legislation that even came into being as a result of her initiatives. So she was a success story, but of course she couldn't be high priest, could she? So she had to appoint one of her sons high priest. That was Hyrcanus II. Hyrcanus then surrogated for her in that capacity as leader. Her other son, Aristobulus II, he didn't like the fact that he was denied rule. He wanted to overthrow her mother. He attempted to overthrow his mother when she was on her deathbed, and he was thwarted temporarily. But eventually he does succeed. He expels his brother from the high priesthood. He becomes king and high priest, but his days were numbered. At this time, the shadow of Rome was now entering the picture once again. The Hasmoneans had actually had good relations with Rome. And in the book of 1 Maccabees, they report in glowing terms these alliances that are made and renewed with the brothers and then later the descendants of Judas. The Senate in Rome was quite happy to write nice letters saying, as we recognize Judean territorial sovereignty over this area, stay away, Seleucids. Seleucids didn't care about those letters, but the point is that they could produce, the Hasmoneans could show these documents to their people and say, look, the greatest power in the world likes us. Look, the greatest power in the world recognizes what we have done. And there's a long eulogy to Rome in 1 Maccabees chapter 8. A long eulogy. I think it's actually in, not this, but in the actual text that we have, which I didn't reproduce, but if you go to the other document, I have a little table that shows you why the Hasmoneans were so into Rome for a time. There we go. Let's keep going down until we reach it. It's probably the next page after this one. There we go. Okay, so this is the summary of this chapter-long eulogy to the Romans. The Romans and the Hasmoneans uniquely share military virtues. They all possess glory and an eternal name. The Romans have a name, a reputation for their greatness as warriors, and so do the Maccabees. But no one else, no other Jews have this reputation. They are mighty warriors like the Maccabees. They perform courageous deeds, literally manly deeds. These are terms in 1 Maccabees that are only applied to Romans and to the Maccabees themselves. They exercise effective counsel. They know how to get things done. Seeman is presented as the ultimate counselor, the wise guy who thwarts Seleucid plots, who gets things done. They are never crushed by their enemies. Now, of course, there are times when the Hasmoneans are defeated, but the verb to be crushed in battle is never used of them. When Judas suffered his first defeat at the hands of the Seleucids, it never says he was crushed. He simply left the battle. And similarly, the Romans in this eulogy are never crushed. They are indomitable. So they share that. And they always crush their enemies. Both the Romans and the Hasmoneans crush their enemies. Finally, they are fearless and they inspire fear. So this is why the Hasmoneans are so into Rome, is that they see in Rome the image of the Republic, an image of themselves, of what they want to project to their own people. This is who we are, and that's why we're aligned with them, because like knows like. Also, they said, however, the Romans have a good political system. Their society is well ordered. Why? Because they have no kings. Right? At the time, the problem are the Seleucid kings. Right? They aren't kings. They have a republic. They're a republican form of government that is a beautiful blending of democracy, aristocratic leadership, and monarchic leadership of the consuls. Right? The consuls whom everyone obeys, echoing the language of Seeman himself in the decree, the popular decree on his behalf. Like the Jews, they have this consultative form of government. They obey and put faith in one ruler, who is a legitimate ruler, and they maintain friendship. They maintain trustworthy friendship with their allies. They're trustworthy, like us, the Jews. So notice there's this painting of the Hasmoneans and the Romans as similar, and then the Jews and the Romans as a people as similar, sharing the same values. And finally, there are some things that Romans do that even the Jews can't quite do. They don't wear purple. That is to say, they don't pretend to be higher than their countrymen, which of course is complete, false. It's false if you know anything about Roman politics. But this is the ideal of Rome as a republic where everyone takes turns ruling happily. Well, by contrast, the Maccabees, they don't do that. They don't rotate their high priests. Right? And this is a liability. This is why the Maccabees depend upon their own achievements to instill love in their people for them, because otherwise those nefarious people are going to try to undermine Israel's constitution. And finally, unlike the Romans, who have no envy or jealousy amongst each other, the Jews are rife with jealousy and envy over their rightful leaders, the Hasmoneans. So there's a bit of cultural criticism in this eulogy, but this is all just one big introduction to the question of why the Romans were so important. The Romans could care less about what happened in Syria or Palestine at this time. From the year 161, when Judas's envoys went there, to the time of John Hyrcanus, who wrote First Maccabees. They could care less about the Jews. They're perfectly happy as the only superpower in the world to write letters on people's behalf to show how benevolent they are. And of course, it's the people on the ground who have to do the fighting. And everyone understood that. The Hasmoneans, this alliance with Rome, served only Hasmonean purposes, and it was a domestic purpose. They didn't think they could scare the Seleucids off. They didn't need to have the Romans to scare the Seleucids off. They had their armies. The Hasmoneans, Alexandra had her army to ward off real threats. But for propaganda purposes, you need the Romans. Now, what's interesting about all this is that once the Hasmoneans claimed kingship, all this language about how great Rome is and the alliance with Rome falls out of our reckoning. We never hear about it again. Could be that we just don't have the evidence. The treaties may have been lost, but more likely, the later Hasmoneans, when they claimed kingship, they chose, as a matter of policy, not to engage the Romans anymore. Now, it's not that the Romans were becoming threatening to anyone in Palestine at the time. Rather, what I think is going on is, if you have this rhetoric of how great our two peoples are because we all love freedom from kings, and we are now kings, it would be kind of dangerous to send aristocratic envoys to Rome to procure more senatorial gestures of support. We could be sending our own usurpers, basically, to come back and undermine us. And this was especially true under Jannaeus, who was fighting this war against his own people. He couldn't risk using that language of liberation, of removing the yoke of the Gentiles from Israel that they wanted in this alliance with Rome. So I would suggest that this alliance, this contact with Rome, dropped out because it was no longer useful to the Hasmoneans. And again, the Romans could care less, except now that we get to the 1st century BCE. Let's go back to our timeline. And the end of Alexandra's rule. What had changed? What had changed was in this latter, or mid-1st century BCE, the Romans were now in charge of most of Asia Minor, most of modern-day Turkey. They were now governing parts of modern-day Turkey as a province of their empire. And this brought them into military conflict with a Turkish, not Turkish, but an Asian dynasty, an Asian king named Mithridates. Mithridates began by slaughtering thousands of Roman citizens in Asia Minor to provoke the Romans into a war so that he could basically get the Romans out of Asia. They fought him in 3 wars, and he kept holding on. He was tenacious. And he also had, he was the son-in-law of another local king, namely Tigranes of Armenia. Tigranes is important for our story because he invades Palestine during Alexandra's rule. And she wards him off with a negotiated truce. But the point is that the whole issue of who was controlling Syria and Palestine would become a Roman issue in these years, because inasmuch as Tigranes, the guy who had invaded Palestine, was the father-in-law of Mithridates, who the Romans were fighting and who was allied with him against them, their enemies became the Romans' enemies. So Tigranes and Mithridates, both these local kings, had made themselves enemies of Rome, and so Rome now had an interest in dismantling their whole kingdoms, their whole empires that they had set up. And this is what brought them in contact with the Jews in a new way. In the year 63 BCE, the year 63, the Roman general Pompey, who was sent to defeat these kings and had succeeded in defeating them. Actually, the year before that, before this defeat, he went and he basically said to the final Seleucid king, "You're fired. Rome will now rule all the Seleucid domain. Right? We will keep order in this part of the world." Mainly because, not that they were interested in Syria, but because they were interested in the coast of the Mediterranean. Because at this time in the 1st century, the Mediterranean was infested by pirates, organized brigands who were largely in the pay of these Asian kings, who were even threatening the grain supply of Italy at the time. And that was a serious threat to the entire world that had to be stopped. And the only way to make sure there'd be no more pirates is if you, Rome, controlled the coasts of the Mediterranean. So the Seleucids were unable to do so anymore. They lost all power. Rome says, "We will now rule Syria as a province." We are right then on the borders of Greater Judea. At this time, the sons of Alexandra, Hyrcanus II, Aristobulus II, were fighting it out. They were again trying to claim the supremacy from one another, and they say, "Hey, the Romans are in town. Let's go ask Pompey for help." So each of the brothers comes to Damascus to appeal to Pompey, "Please support my claim to the kingship of Judea." Pompey wasn't really interested in their arguments, but he was interested in the fact that a large delegation of Jewish nobles, 200 we're told by one historian, came and denounced both of these Hasmoneans, and they said, "Our ancestors made an alliance with Rome. And the terms of this alliance was that our country would not be under the dominion of kings. These men, these Hasmoneans, have basically violated that alliance, the terms of that compact that we had with you, with the Senate. They have enslaved us. They have done everything the Seleucids did to us, and we want them gone." Pompey still wasn't that interested in dealing with this. This was really on the borders of his area of concern, but unfortunately, one of the two brothers, Aristobulus, decided to make an issue of it by withdrawing to Jerusalem and fortifying it for war. And Pompey then marched on Jerusalem and conquered it in the year 63 BC. This is the beginning of the history of Roman rule over the Jews. It was in 63. It might have gone otherwise. The Romans really were not concerned with southern Syria, with Palestine at this time. For the next several decades, Jews who didn't like being subject to Rome all of a sudden, or perhaps who didn't like the high priest that Pompey put back in charge, namely Alexandra's son Hyrcanus. He didn't make him king again, he just made him high priest and ruler of the people, basically going back to the days of Seeman, that understanding of authority. Pompey said, this is the way things are going to be, and if Jews didn't like it, they rebelled. The Romans had to contend with almost 4 rebellions, 5 actually if you count one that Julius Caesar started during the Civil War of Rome. There were constant rebellions against Roman rule, and the Romans basically didn't take them seriously. They suppressed them and then they allowed the leaders to go free. They really were not concerned with Palestine at this time. It was down here on their list of priorities. But then something happened, which we call the Civil War, the Roman Civil War. We all know the story of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, and Pompey, the guy who conquered Jerusalem, standing up to him, and basically all the resources of the Roman Empire and all of their allies and subjects would now be brought to bear into this internecine conflict between the 2 great warlords, Caesar and Pompey. In the year 48, Caesar defeated Pompey in Greece. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was assassinated, and Caesar got embroiled in a big conflict in Egypt about supporting Cleopatra as queen. He was almost defeated. He was almost killed in this struggle, which is called the Alexandrian War, because it happened in the city of Alexandria, were it not for the Jewish high priest who led an army to Egypt to support him. So the Hyrcanus II, the Jewish high priest, the Hasmonean, led an army of Jewish soldiers to save Julius Caesar's life. And he managed to do this because, as high priest, he was able to go to that other Jewish community in Egypt that had their own temple. Apparently there were no Oniad high priests there anymore, but they had their community. And he said, "Let us pass, I'm the high priest." And they said yes. So Hyrcanus, the last Hasmonean ruler that we're going to talk about, he did Caesar a great favor. And Caesar was grateful to him. So much so that he basically allowed the Jews in Palestine to recuperate most of what they had lost from Pompey's conquest. Pompey had basically dismembered the Jewish state, left it just, again, Judah and Jerusalem, that stark county-sized place of land. And Julius Caesar gave them back some of their ports. He restored the control of taxes to their own people. He did a lot of great things. Josephus our historian records all these documents about these decrees of Caesar on behalf of Hyrcanus and the Jews. And he also, and this is the interesting part of our story about Hasmonean authority, he also, in a decree, said, Hyrcanus will be high priest and ruler of the Jews in perpetuity, and his sons will inherit that role. So we now come full circle. At the beginning of our story, the high priest was an appointee of the Seleucid Empire. Right? And whatever stability that priestly rule had was because of that empire. We had now come full circle. They had thrown off the yoke of empire. They had declared an independent nation. They had become kings as well as high priests. Now we're back to the place where the Roman general is supporting a genealogical concept of priesthood, but without kingship. Now finally, this nice thing that might have lasted but didn't because the civil war kept going on. Caesar was assassinated, as we all know, and there was more bloodshed in the region. What finally brought things to the demise of the Hasmoneans as leaders was in the year 40 BCE. In the year 40 BCE, the losers in the civil war, the assassins of Caesar, fled to the Parthians. They fled beyond Syria into Mesopotamia, where the Parthians were now ruling quite happily. And they said, "Would you like to invade Syria? If you help us against Mark Antony and Octavian and all those guys in Rome, we will let you take Syria." "Great," said the Parthians, "let's do it." So the Parthians, a rival empire, a threat to Rome, invades the Levant, invades the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. And in other words, suddenly, minuscule Judea Judea, which had no importance to the Romans, suddenly becomes a geopolitical linchpin. If Judea is lost, then we can't move by land from Syria to Egypt, which is another important place that we now hold. If Judea is under the control of someone hostile to us, that's intolerable. And what happens when the Parthians come in? Hyrcanus, who's happily living with all these privileges that he has from Caesar, he is captured. And a son of Aristobulus, a son of his brother, so his nephew, whose name is Antigonus, who goes to the Parthians and says, "Make me king. Make me king of the Jews." They say, "Sure." So the Parthians back Hasmonean as the king of the Jews, the king of the Judeans. And when his uncle Hyrcanus is captured, in this marvelously gruesome passage in Josephus, Antigonus leaps at his uncle, wrenches his head to one side, and gnaws his ears, lacerates his ears with his own teeth, thereby rendering him bodily disabled from performing the role of high priest, because a high priest has to be bodily whole. And so he disqualifies his uncle as high priest. There's no way Hyrcanus can become high priest again, even if the Romans wanted it. So again, like Alcimus, who sabotaged that peace deal between Judas and the Seleucids, Antigonus is sabotaging this wonderful relationship that the Hasmoneans are trying to create with Julius Caesar and his allies in Rome, and he shatters it all in one instant. Well, what happens is, as king of the Jews, as high priest of the Jews, the Hasmonean dynasty will go through him, except that one person escaped from this, and that was Herod, one of Hyrcanus' allies. Herod escaped capture. He fled to Rome, and at the end of the year 40, he was walked into the Senate by Julius Caesar's friends Mark Antony and the future Emperor Augustus, Octavian, and both of them spoke well of his friend Hyrcanus. Actually, Herod was a son-in-law of Hyrcanus at this point. He says, "We should support this guy. The Parthians have just declared an enemy of Rome to be king. So what do you think we're going to do? Appoint Herod a provincial administrator? No. We're going to meet this challenge head on. We will make Herod king of the Jews against the Parthians candidate." And so they said, "Okay, Herod, go and fight for your throne. We'll give you some help." So between the years 40 and 37, Herod fights against Antigonus, defeats him, captures Jerusalem, carts him off to Antioch or some city in northern Syria, where he is summarily executed by a Roman general. Thus ends the Hasmonean high priesthood, the Hasmonean dynasty. It is an end. Actually, there's one more Hasmonean. It's a grandson of Hyrcanus that Herod tries to maneuver as a high priest, because of course Herod is not a priestly lineage, he's an Idumean. So he can't be high priest, so he has to find some high priest. So he tries to work with the Hasmonean, this little kid basically, to make him high priest, but he's too popular, so he has him drowned. And that's the end of the Hasmoneans. Herod comes to power as a result of this imperial clash between the imperial space of Rome and the imperial space of Parthia. Imperial politics dictated the outcome. No one could have changed it, really. Okay, so that's the story of rise and decline, victory and tragedy. What was the impact of Hasmonean rule on the Jewish understanding of Messiah? Well, again, it's precisely, notice the two things the Hasmoneans are doing. They are not Davidic, they're not of the tribe of Judah, and yet they are claiming that specific prerogative of kingship. So if you're a critic of the Hasmoneans, you're going to look to the Davidic tradition of covenant to denounce them. But they did another thing too. As priests, they combined the priesthood with kingship. So guess what their enemies at Qumran did? They said, there are going to be two messiahs, a priest and a king. We're going to make clear that the ideal form of Israel's constitution, there is a separation of powers. So why are there two messiahs? In the language of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's because the Hasmoneans combine these offices. That's why they have two messiahs. Let's actually look now at our text, the other document, and we'll look at some of these passages from the Dead Sea Scrolls that illustrate this. a little further. So we're going to go on here. Rolling like that. Keep rolling, keep rolling, keep rolling. Okay, here we go. Okay, so here's some snippets from the Dead Sea Scrolls that illustrates this. The first is the Damascus document, what's called the Damascus document. It's basically a story of the origin of this community and its sense of mission in the world, what its sense of mission is, to establish a purified Israel, an Israel that is not that is not run by the wrong high priests, for example, who become kings, and other things. They said, they speak of those who follow the statutes, that is to say, the Torah, those who follow the Torah with understanding during the age of wickedness. So the age of the Hasmoneans was the age of wickedness, until the coming of the Messiah of Aaron and of Israel. Now it's a singular Messiah, but Aaron and Israel is their code word for these two Messiahs. So Aaron, of course, is the priest, right? And in the Old Testament, in the Torah, he is the anointed priest. That's how he's described. So remember, Messiah means anointed one, and it could be used in an adjectival sense with regard to the Kohen, the priest. So Aaron, the Messiah of Aaron, is the anointed priest who will come. And notice it's a future reality. We don't have these figures here now. The Hasmoneans are ruling us now. But in the future, two Messiahs will come, a priest and one for all Israel, one who will be a ruler figure. A little later it says, when we're talking about the proper interpretation of the Torah, the proper halakha, by which people will be judged during the age of wickedness until the rising of the Messiah of Aaron and Israel, and then the iniquity of Israel will be expiated, will be cleansed by the work of these two individuals. And a little further up, another Damascus document, quote, "Those who are left after the age of wickedness will be given over to the sword at the coming of the Messiah of Aaron and Israel." So these Messiahs, these anointed ones, their role will be to exterminate recalcitrant Jews who do not abide by the Torah. This is all good Deuteronomy language here. Finally, from the day of the gathering in of the teacher of the community, that's what they call the leader of their community. They called him the teacher of righteousness. We don't know his real name. Since his gathering in, since he was killed by Jonathan, the wicked priest, until the rising of a Messiah from Aaron and from Israel. So their chronology of history, in a sense, the climactic age of human history, the age of wickedness, begins with the death of their leader, supposedly by Hasmonean hands, to the coming of these Messiahs. That's the end of the world, according to them, right? So we're living in the final generation, and that's why we're living out in the desert. We're living out in the desert, recreating the ideal Israel while Israel goes to hell in a handbasket under the Hasmoneans. Another document that talks about this, the community rule. This is sort of like the rules for being members of this community. It says, "They shall depart from none of the counsels of the Torah. They shall not walk in the stubbornness of their own hearts, but shall be ruled by the original precepts which the men of the community were first instructed, until there shall come the prophet and the Messiahs of Aaron and Israel." So there's another eschatological prophet. This is sort of like in the books of Maccabees. Until a trustworthy prophet shall arise to rightly order Israel, we will rule in the meantime, says the Maccabees. But it's very clear that these are not equal offices. The royal Messiah and the priestly Messiah, the priestly Messiah has a superior status. And this is very clear from what's called the Messianic rule, a text which is basically about what will salvation look like. Well, it will look like a banquet in which all the community of Israel participates. That's what salvation looks like. And how will we be seated at this banquet? Well, it begins when God begets the Messiah, by which we probably mean the priestly Messiah. When God begets this Messiah, he will enter in with them at the head of the congregation of Israel and his brothers, the sons of Aaron. So it's very clear this is the priestly Messiah. They shall come in next. So we have the priestly Messiah, the sons of Aaron come after him. They shall sit before him, each in their order of dignity. And after that, the Messiah of Israel, that is to say, the royal Messiah will come. So the royal Messiah is beneath the priests. This is a community that sees priests as the true leaders. And that's actually the standard understanding for most of the Second Temple period up until now. Most of the images we get from various Jewish texts emphasize the primacy of the priesthood over any kind of royal rule, because there's no realistic prospect for royal rule under these empires, is there? So there's no sense to imagine a future in which there's going to be a royal ruler. We're quite happy living under high priests, or at least the high priests wanted to think so. And what will these priests, what will these messiahs do? We hear that the priest is the one who blesses everything first at the table. And then after that it says the Messiah of Israel, the royal priest, extends his hand over the bread to bless it, each in the order of his dignity. Okay, let's go up. A few other types of sources here. These are the Qumran Jews, they often commented on the Tanakh, on Scripture. And it's in these commentaries, again, that we see this, what we might call a messianic consciousness emerging, an emerging consciousness that the prophecies of the Old Testament refer to something that is yet to come. And so a commentary on Genesis 49, this is when Jacob gives his blessings to his 12 sons in Egypt, where he says, the scepter shall not depart from the tribe of Judah. So that's the traditional understanding that this validates the rule of the house of David before the house of David exists. And how did the Qumranites interpret that? It says, the ruler's staff is the covenant of kingship, and the clans of Israel are the divisions, until the Messiah of righteousness comes, the branch of David. So now we have an explicit coming Davidic Messiah as this royal Messiah. To him and his seed is granted the covenant of kingship over his people for everlasting generations. Another text called the Messianic, and of course these titles are modern scholars have given these titles to them. They don't have titles in the original. The Messianic Apocalypse, so this is the revelation of what the end of history looks like. The heavens and the earth will listen to God's Messiah, and none therein will stray from the commandments of the Holy One. So again, the role of the royal Messiah is to enforce the Torah, right? Just as the role of the king in the book of Deuteronomy is to see that the Torah is observed. And another text called the Midrash, the interpretation of the last days, it's speaking of the royal Messiah. He is the branch of David who shall arise with the interpreter of the law, which could either be the priest, the Messiah, or someone else, to rule in Zion at the end of time. And then various prophetic passages quoted there. Let's go a little further up. I think there may be one more. Oh, we have something new here. Good. Okay, so that's what we get. That's a sampling of what we have from Qumran, the greatest critics of the Hasmoneans, who hated them from the beginning. It's very clear that the shape of their messianic expectation was dictated by their experience of Hasmonean rule and their critique of the form that rule took. So that's why I've spent so much time tonight talking about the form of how the Hasmoneans legitimized themselves. That shaped messianic expectation. Without that, if the Hasmoneans hadn't been priests and kings, we might not have had this way of thinking. Okay, the next text we get, the Psalms of Solomon. The Psalms of Solomon are a series of poems probably written after the conquest of Jerusalem by Pompey, because there's a reference to Pompey's death in one of the Psalms. We're going to read part of this and just see. The reference to the Messiah comes later. And it's called the Psalms of Solomon, not because Solomon is presented as an author of it, but simply because many of much of the imagery of the royal Messiah here comes from the parts of the Bible that deal with Solomon. Okay, it says, Lord, you are our King forever, for in you, O God, does our soul take pride. How long is the time of a person's life on earth? As is his time, so also is his hope in himself. But we hope in God, our Savior, for the strength of our God is forever with mercy. The kingdom of our God is forever over the nations in judgment. Lord, you chose David to be king over Israel, and swore to him about his descendants forever, that his kingdom should not fail before you. So here we're going back to David, 2 Samuel 7, as sort of the ideal mandate for rule. But because of our sins, sinners rose up against us, and they set upon us and drove us out. We're not sure who is being driven out here. But it's interesting that by calling them sinners rather than foreigners, it's pretty clear that we're talking about we're talking about other Jews who are the ones who are driving us out. Those whom you did not make this promise to, they took away from us by force. They did not glorify your honorable name. With pomp they set up a monarch because of their arrogance. They despoiled the throne of David with arrogant shouting. So presumably this is a critique of Hasmonean kingship. And again, let's continue on here.
But you, O God, overthrew them. You uprooted their descendants from the earth, for there rose up against them a man alien to our race. This is probably a reference to Pompey. You rewarded them, O God, according to their sins. It happened to them according to their actions. According to their actions, God showed no mercy to them. He hunted down their descendants and did not even let one of them go. The Lord is faithful in all his judgments which he makes in the world. So here we have a narrative, an interpretation of the Hasmonean dynasty's fall, starting with Pompey. So Pompey is now playing the role of Assyria in the prophets, right? Assyria is the rod of my anger, says God. Now Pompey is the rod of his anger against the Hasmoneans. Let's move up a little further here. See, Lord, and raise up from them their king, the son of David, to rule over your servant Israel until the time known to you, God. Undergird him with the strength to destroy the unrighteous rulers, to purge Jerusalem from Gentiles who trample her to destruction. In wisdom and in righteousness drive out the sinners from their inheritance, to smash the arrogance of the sinners like a potter's jar, to shatter all their substance with an iron rod. This is the language of Psalm 2 and some of the other psalms about Davidic rule. So it's evoking the language of the Psalms here. And so it moves on. Let's go to the end of this. There's a lot more killing and all that going here. Let's go a little further so we can see the actual reference to Messiah right here at the end. Okay, here we go. And he will bring a righteous king over them, taught by God. There will be no unrighteousness among Israel in his days, for he shall be holy, and their king shall be the Lord's Messiah. So you have a unique expression here, the Lord's Messiah. Or rather, the Lord Messiah is another way that it's used here. And this is an expression that's used in Luke's Gospel in the New Testament. So it appears to be aware of this document, or at least aware of the idea, the language of it. Okay, the last text we're looking at then is 1 Enoch. And we can actually scan through that to the end here. I won't read through the whole thing here. I just want to catch the bit here. So again, the scenario is that God is going to judge the world. There's no specific reference to Israel here, of course, because in Enoch's day, Israel didn't exist. So it's a global judgment of righteousness and wickedness. But it is being presided over by this messianic figure, who is called the Messiah, and all those other images from the Tanakh that have to do with various forms of surrogation of divine rule. Although it's not at all clear that this is a human being here. He seems to be a heavenly figure. In some versions, it even appears that Enoch himself is this Son of Man / anointed one / chosen one. So it's unclear. But in any case, this too cannot be dated before the fall of Jerusalem to Pompey. It comes from the experience of the end of Hasmonean rule and of Roman rule. So this is a different take on it. Has no evidence that there's any language of Davidic kingship here, or even of priestly messiahs. This is a primordial Messiah, primordial anointed figure mandated by God to judge the living and the dead, the righteous and the wicked. So now, of course, there's other texts in Judaism that deal with ideas of messianic expectation, but none of them can be dated precisely to this period. There's a lot to come, especially after the year 70 CE with the destruction of the temple. And of course, there's the New Testament, which in some way participates in this stream of tradition, in its language, in its imagination of Jesus as messianic figure. But again, let's go back to our basic principle. These ideas didn't come out of nowhere. The later rabbis, as the later Christians, would, having inherited these ideas as natural and obvious, obviously project them as being in the mind of God from all eternity. As being evident to anyone who reads the Tanakh. You can see that this is all about a future coming Messiah, even if it doesn't say so. The reason why you can make that interpretive leap is because of this history. Okay, so here again we come back to history. How is it that Christians could interpret Jesus with the idea of a future coming Messiah, or for that matter, how could Jesus, as a Jew of the first century, think in these categories? How could the early rabbis do the same? They couldn't think these thoughts if it weren't for the experience of Hasmonean rule and the failure of that rule. They couldn't do that, or at least that's the historical matrix in which this emerges. Now, of course, then, there is no single messianic expectation. They're all different. The rabbis have ideas, the Christians have ideas, Qumran had ideas, the authors of these documents had ideas. They're all different.
But they all go back to this same history. Without the history, the ideas have no future, in a sense. You can't account for them unless you understand the history. And so that comes back to this is the main point of the talk tonight and of the last talk, is that what we share in common in terms of these core beliefs is rooted in a common history. And the more we understand that history, the more we can appreciate the distinctives that we have in each of our traditions about how our own imagination of the world to come, the resurrection, the Messiah is like, if we trace back and look at the experiences that those differences are rooted in. Right? But ultimately, it goes back to the same unified history of Jewish experience. Without that, Christians cannot understand the New Testament. Jews cannot understand the rabbis without fully understanding this history here. So I think I'm going to stop there and open it up to questions. So, any questions or comments?
I got a question.
Please.
Do you think the people of the Qumran community focus their energy on the Davidic dynasty as a way to cut off the Hasmonean dynasty that was being created down to the priestly side?
So the question is, did Qumran harp on the idea of the branch of David as so important, not simply because it's in the Tanakh, but because it was strategically effective for undermining Hasmonean claims? I would think so. I would think so. Again, what's stark to us and surprising to us is we always think that the Jews had messianic expectations about the house of David. But if you really read the prophets carefully in their historical context, they're not envisioning a future figure who is going to redeem the world or judge the world or whatever messiahs do. You have simply a sort of mundane restoration of the house of David. But you simply don't have any of that until now. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that the sudden emphasis on David after it had languished for so long is precisely a rhetorical challenge to the Hasmoneans. So it's their claiming of kingship that makes that strategy effective. If they had never claimed kingship, we might not have had Davidic messianic expectation. We might have had priestly messianic expectation. And we do have other documents from Qumran that envision a purely priestly sort of future, in which we have one document called the Aramaic Levi document, which is all about the greatness of the priesthood of Aaron, and how the priest exercises and fulfills the ruling function that the house of David used to. So that's there. So I think you're absolutely right that it's part of that history. The last time we do hear about the house of David, by the way, is in as a sort of an actual realistic historical force, as opposed to simply a utopian speculation, is in the prophet Zechariah. And Zechariah imagines Zerubbabel, who was the descendant of David at that time in the 5th century, still the end of the 6th century BCE. Zerubbabel and Joshua, the high priest. Zerubbabel, the descendant of David, was a Persian governor. He was governing Judah for the Persians. And it's interesting that in the 520s, again to 515, when the temple was rebuilt, that was right following the most cataclysmic uprising against Persian rule that we know of. Darius, the Persian king of the time, faced rebellions from Afghanistan to Europe, and he was hard pressed to put them all down. And so it's not surprising that after that event, which is when the book of Zechariah is written, after that event, the Persians might not have been so crazy about having former native monarchs governing their provinces, because if you read the book of Zechariah, Zechariah sees a royal future for Zerubbabel. He will be this king who restores the house of David, but it never happened. Did the Persians just send them off to the farm somewhere and have them disappear? We don't know. But anyway, during those centuries, the house of David means nothing in terms of the active speculation of the Jews. It's the Hasmoneans that make David important, ironically. Yeah. Other thoughts? Questions? Yeah.
This is in perspective for me. You had said that Judea was originally about the size of Starkhan.
800 square miles.
What was the population size?
What was the population of Judea at any point during this period?
More Maccabean rebels.
During the Maccabean rebels.
500, 10,000?
Well, we don't know for certain, obviously, but survey archaeologies, where you're surveying, you're comparing the space of land, square mileage, to how many areas are actually settled at a particular given time, and then you use sort of calculations of average population density. You create a model and you create a simulation, and you guess. Most scholars today, there are debates. Most scholars would not venture beyond 15,000 total, maybe even less. So, if you will, there's 15,000 Jews maybe living in Palestine at this time, at the time of the Maccabean revolt. We know that they didn't all live within that Stark County size, because some of them lived in those neighboring areas, but we're still dealing with a minuscule population. Again, the majority of Jews at this time lived in Egypt or in Babylonia. Right? We don't have a lot of sources, contemporary sources on Babylonian Jewry at this time, but we know from, obviously, the Talmuds later on, that this is where it was at. Isaiah had to spend 15 chapters trying to convince the Jews to come back. He didn't succeed very well. Most Jews stayed. That Babylonia was their home. They grew up there. They were born there. Why should we leave? Just as why should we go back to Poland or Lithuania because our ancestors were from there? We have no reason to go back there. We might want to go visit, but we don't have an existential need to go back there. So we move during this period from exile to diaspora, the willingness to live where you're born, right? And Jews lived in Egypt. According to, in the time of Philo, the Jewish philosopher of the 1st century CE, he said there may be up to 1 million Jews living in Egypt. 1 million versus the 15,000 we had in Judea at the time. Obviously, by that time there were more Jews living in Palestine, but that's the figures. That's sort of the ballpark we're working with. No more than 20,000. Or, some people might even say 30,000. But we're talking about small amounts. Yeah. Anything else?
50 years later, down the road, we're going to start talking about political religious groups like Sadducees and Pharisees and so on. And we'll put labels on them and say that they were real political philosophies. Mm-hmm. What are the origins that can be traced back to the Hasmonean dynasty, for example?
Okay, so the question is about these later sects, about which Josephus waxes quite a bit in his writings from the 1st century CE. What can we say? What can we know about the Sadducees and the Pharisees? We don't hear about the Essenes back then, but what can we know about these two very prominent groups in the later sources? The simple answer is next to nothing, because Josephus is our only source, and he is thoroughly biased. He hates the Pharisees because they're lower class upstarts, and he's an aristocrat. He doesn't like the Sadducees for some reason because they don't follow the traditions of most Jews. But what can we know about them? It does seem that under Shalamzian Alexandra, the ruling queen of the Hasmoneans, it does seem, again also from later rabbinic traditions, that the Pharisees gained a great deal of halakhic prominence and halakhic influence. Halakhic means, again, the interpretation and application of the Torah to the contemporary life of how you live that out. So it's sort of like not quite the same as canon law in the Catholic tradition, but it's the supplement to the law, right? The supplement to the Torah. The Pharisees do seem to have exercised a good deal of influence under her reign, but we don't get a lot of details in those passages of Josephus that tells us what their philosophy was, or he calls them philosophies because we have to remember what defines Jews as a people is the Torah for Josephus. That's our constitution, he says. Everything else, specific beliefs you may have, no, the Torah is, the Constitution defines us as a people. If you want to have religious beliefs, you go join a philosophical sect like the Pharisees and Sadducees. But we really don't know a lot about what those were, only from Josephus. And unfortunately, we have no evidence of the Pharisees or the Sadducees ever writing anything on their own. Many scholars have wanted to argue that the Psalms of Solomon were written by Pharisees. But that's just pulling a straw out of a hat. It's actually based on a very bad scholarly presupposition that if Josephus says that these were the sects, every piece of literature must come from one of them. Which which is ridiculous. People, societies are much more diverse than that. We know that the Pharisees and Sadducees were very small groups, maybe 1% of the population. So it's really not helpful to sort of find the literature at the time and sort of slot it as Pharisee or Sadducee. There are some that might have family resemblances in certain ideas, but then again, the Pharisees, we're told by Josephus, believed in things that most Jews believed in. Right? They believed in resurrection. We know that from both the New Testament as well as from Josephus and the rabbis. So that was, in a sense, bringing them back to the persecution of the realm. There has been an interesting theory recently, scholarly theory recently, that the Pharisees sort of evolved out of the experience of the Antiochene persecution because they realized that during that crisis, and indeed after it as well, it was possible for Israel to be denied full access to the rituals and the sacrifices and the personnel, legitimate personnel of the temple. So if the Torah says that the center of your life is the temple, but historically the temple can be dysfunctional, the response of the Pharisees was to say, well, let's take the essence of the Torah's teachings and let's see if we can empower all Jews to manifest that kind of holiness in the household, right? In the household especially. Thereby, Israel can remain in a state of holiness, or some kind of state of moving towards holiness, even if the temple is defiled and even if it is under the control of people we don't like. That's sort of one of the things that you can sort of work into speculating how the Pharisees evolved this idea of the sanctification of all Israel, which is the one part of their ideas that the rabbis certainly did embrace and develop. For the Sadducees, we know next to nothing about them, so it's really hard to know anything from Josephus, unfortunately. But that might change someday. We are told in the Dead Sea Scrolls of various groups that they don't like, which they give code words for. They call disobedient Israelites Ephraim, the northerners. The code word for the Pharisees apparently is the seekers after smooth things. That is, say, the liberals. Those who want to soften the precepts of the Torah. Whereas we are the real manly Israelites who, make sure everyone observes the law to the nth degree. The Pharisees get an unfair rap in the New Testament as being sort of legalists and, fundamentalists. But actually, it was the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, that were that. The Pharisees were the flexible ones. They wanted to bring the sanctification of God's people into everyday life. And they're dumped upon by the New Testament authors in part because they're so much alike in their theology. But yeah, that's some random thoughts on to respond to that question.
Thank you.
Anything else? Well, we're getting close to our time. We've got 8 minutes left. We could stop early. Anything else? No? Going once, going twice?
Cards.
All right. Thank you for attending. For attending this program, as well as if you've been to any of our other lifelong learning events, thanks for coming. And we hope to see you next spring for some more great